Good afternoon. We are pleased to welcome you to the Washington Labs Academy webinar series. We hope you find the next hour or so useful and informative. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Pieter Robben. Pieter Robben is a regulatory review engineer at ACB Europe. Pieter is a TCB for the FCC and an FCB for ICIT, formerly Industry Canada, an RCB for Japan, and a notified body for the radio and telecommunications terminal equipment and EMC directives. Pieter has been reviewing FCC applications since before the TCB program was created. He is well known in the European community as past chairman of the radio and telecommunications terminal equipment. Pieter has been working with Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication, also known as MIC, matters since the inauguration of the Japan-EU Mutual Recognition Arrangement. Pieter's past experience includes EMC, radio and safety testing and certification for test laboratories and manufacturers. He has been in the industry for more than 20 years. Pieter provides worldwide services to ACB's global customers from his office in the Netherlands. So, without further ado, let's turn our attention to EU Radio Equipment Directive Update with Pieter Robben. Hi, Pieter.
Hello, everybody. My name is Pieter Robben, and today we are going to look at the Radio Equipment Directive. It's a compressed version of the main points in the Radio Equipment Directive and also shows its current state. Since the publication, quite a few things have changed, and more recently, several amendments have been introduced. Several essential requirements have been activated, which are important for most manufacturers. So let's talk a little bit about where this directive can be accepted or where it is valid. Obviously, it's valid in the whole of the EU, the European Union, which is a group of European countries which act as an economic unit. Currently, there are 27 member states. Used to be 28.
Pieter,
Yeah.
are you able to reshare? I don't see it there.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
Can you see? Okay, so the European Union, 27 EU member states. There used to be 28, but the UK unfortunately has left the EU, so there are 27. If you comply with the Radio Equipment Directive, you basically have access on the market of these 27 EU member states. Then we have the EFTA, which is the European Free Trade Association, and in that association, 4 countries are gathered, which is Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. So also in these countries, the Radio Equipment Directive is applicable. Then we have the EEA, and that unites the EU member states and 3 EFTA states into an internal market governed by the same basic rules. It must be noted that although Switzerland is a member of EFTA, Switzerland has basically an MRA with the EU to accept certain regulations, and the Radio Equipment Directive is one of these regulations. So also in Switzerland, the Radio Equipment Directive is applicable. It's important to realize that there are several types of EU legislation. First type is the regulation, and regulations have direct effect, as they call it. It means that if the European Commission issues a regulation, it's immediately active and valid in all EU member states. As you may have noticed, more recently, the European Commission has issued more regulations than directives, and it is to ensure a speedy implementation of EU law in all EU member states. A directive is an act addressed to EU member states, and this means that if the Commission issues a directive, it must be transposed in national law of each individual member state. That usually takes quite some time, and which is the reason that some directives have been mutated into regulations at some point in time to make sure that they keep up with the market. There are also decisions like spectrum decisions. If the European Commission issues a decision for a certain frequency band where the technical requirements are harmonized across all EU member states, they may issue a decision to validate this. There's also opinions and recommendations. They do not have legal binding force, and consequently they are not provided with direct effect. Then we have the Blue Guide. The Blue Guide is dealing with the implementation of EU product rules. It's a guide to the implementation of directives or regulations. It's basically a legally non-binding guide of the interpretation of how EU member states should deal with the directives and regulations. The latest and revised version was published in June 2022, and I've provided a link where that can be downloaded. So the Blue Guide is intended to contribute to a better understanding of EU product rules and to their more uniform and coherent application across different sectors and throughout the single market. So it's addressed to the member states. So that means that member states are supposed to follow the interpretations as found in the Blue Guide to make sure that regulations and directives are treated the same way across the whole of the EU. It's a guidance document. Obviously, sometimes it can happen that guidance may conflict with the actual text of the European Union Harmonization Acts. In the end, if there's a discrepancy between an interpretation in the Blue Guide and a directive or regulation, the text of the directive and regulation are the legally binding ones. It applies to EU member states, but also to Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway as signatories of the EEA, as well as Turkey in certain cases. CE marking. The letter CE appear on many products traded on the extended single market in the EEA, and it signifies that products sold in the EEA have been assessed to meet high safety, health, and environmental protection requirements. It's supposed to support fair competition by holding all companies accountable to the same rules. And by affixing the CE marking to a product, a manufacturer declares that the product meets all legal requirements for CE marking and can be sold throughout the EEA. This also applies to products made in other countries that are sold in the EEA. And CE marking is part of the EU's harmonization legislation. So please note that CE marking on a product means that all legislation must be met. So if you have a radio equipment or a product which contains a radio and is thus radio equipment, the radio equipment directive may not be the only regulation or act applicable to the product. So by complying with only the radio equipment directive, that does not necessarily mean that you can then put the CE marking to a product. So a manufacturer must basically follow 6 steps to affix a CE marking to a product. You have to identify the applicable directive decisions or regulations and harmonize standards when available. As you may or may not know, the number of harmonized standards on the RED is quite extensive. except that it's currently very complicated and difficult and time consuming to get a new harmonized standard on the list of harmonized standards. So in some cases, you may not find a harmonized standard, and then you need to apply the best available standard or test specification available, which could be used to justify compliance with the directive or the regulations. You need to verify product specific requirements. You need to identify whether an independent conformity assessment by a notified body is necessary. You need to test the product and check its conformity. And you draw up and keep available the required technical documentation. After all this, you can affix the CE marking and draw up the EU Declaration of Conformity. Again, if multiple directives or decisions or regulations are applicable to the product, you can only apply the CE marking after compliance with all directives has been verified. So, the Radio Equipment Directive. It was published on May 22, 2014 in the Official Journal of the EU. It entered into force on 11th of June 2014, and it has fully replaced the old RNTT directive on June 13th, 2016. And radio equipment which has been placed on the EU market on 13 June 2017 and onwards, only the radio equipment directive is applicable. The RNTT directive is no longer applicable to any radio product. So the primary objective of the RED is to enable the free movement of radio equipment within the EU. So it harmonizes technical requirements, but in a high level and limited to those requirements necessary to satisfy the essential requirements relating to radio equipment. However, compliance with the RED does not necessarily mean that you can actually put it into service in one or more EU member states, EA states, and Switzerland. Compliance with the essential requirements is only intended to enable the free movement of radio equipment. Putting it into service depends on the individual member state, and if a certain radio product cannot be used there, you can still put it on the market for trade, but you cannot actually put it into service. So there are quite a few people who have the misunderstanding that, for instance, the Radio Equipment Directive works the same as the FCC rules or the ISET regulations. If you comply with the standard or the requirements, you can basically place it on the market and put it into service across the whole of America or the whole of Canada. The RED only facilitates free movement of radio equipment. So you need to check each individual member states where you want to sell the product with the objective that actually somebody can use it. You need to check each member state if that's actually possible. So the RED does not apply to certain radio equipment which is in Annex 1 to the RED. It's radio equipment used by amateurs within the meaning of the ITU radio regulation, unless the equipment is made available on the market. So if a radio amateur builds his own device, you do not necessarily need to comply with the directive. If you have commercial ham radio equipment which is available on the market, that equipment needs to comply with the RED. There's certain equipment falling within the Directive 96/98 EC on marine equipment. Airborne products, parts and appliances are excluded. What's not excluded is air traffic management system or ground-based air traffic management systems, but airborne products are excluded. Custom-built evaluation kits are also excluded, and custom-built must be taken literally. Obviously, there are quite a few evaluation kits for manufacturers on the market, but if you can just buy them as a manufacturer or a consumer, those kits need to comply with the RED. It also does not apply to radio equipment exclusively used for activities concerning public security, defense, state security, including the economic well-being of the state in the case of activities pertaining to state security matters, etc., etc. So it does not apply. Having said that, it is not forbidden that a customer of a manufacturer who wants to use radio equipment for these activities cannot require that it also complies with the Radio Equipment Directive. So it could be a customer demand, and even though it's not really required. Some definitions which are slightly important. Radio waves is defined in the RED frequencies lower than 3000 gigahertz propagated in space without artificial guide. So there is no lower limit defined. In the RNTTE directive, there was a lower limit of 9 kilohertz that has been removed in the radio equipment directive. So it goes from 0 to 3000 gigahertz. Making available on the market means any supply of radio equipment for distribution, consumption, or use on the union market in the course of a commercial activity, whether in return for payment or free of charge. And the free of charge is obviously important to note here, that if you give stuff away, that doesn't mean that you don't need to comply with this directive. Placing on the market means the first making available of radio equipment on the union market. There is a very important issue with this. It's placing on the market is not related to a batch of product or a series of product or models or types of product. It applies to each individual radio equipment. So if you manufacture radio equipment, you place it on the market in the EU, then products which arrive in the EU on a certain date before legislation becomes applicable, that's okay. Any product, the same product, which arrives after a date of application in the EU needs to comply with all the regulations which are at that moment applicable. Now we jump to the essential requirements of the RED, and here are some changes which have become active over the years. Article 3.1 has not been changed yet. It's the protection of health and safety of persons and domestic animals, including the objectives which respect the safety requirements set out in Directive 2014/35 EU, also known as the Low Voltage Directive, but with no voltage limit applying. This does not mean that you can apply the Low Voltage Directive to radio equipment. It only means that you can use or must use the safety objectives as noted in the Low Voltage Directive. Sometimes I see applications where people still note the Low Voltage Directive as being complied with, but that's incorrect. Radio equipment is excluded from the Low Voltage Directive. 3.1b, an adequate level of electromagnetic compatibility is set out in Directive 2014/30 EU, also known as the EMC Directive. Also here, this does not mean that you should apply the EMC Directive on radio equipment on its own. It only references to the adequate level of EMC. The EMC Directive is not applicable to radio equipment on its own. Article 3.2 of the RED, radio equipment shall be so constructed that it both effectively uses and supports the efficient use of radio spectrum in order to avoid harmful interference. This specifically references to the use of the radio spectrum by transmitters and receivers and transceivers. Article 3.3. So we start with a summary of what's currently in Article 3.3. At the start of when the RED was published, only one article or one aspect within this article was actually activated, which was Article 3.3G for a specific type of radio equipment. So these are the essential requirements or other essential requirements. Radio equipment needs to interwork with accessories, in particular with common chargers. That text has been changed now because common chargers are now within a new essential requirement. Radio equipment interworks via networks with other radio equipment. That one has not been activated yet. Radio equipment can be connected to interfaces of the appropriate type throughout the Union. That one has also not been activated yet. Article 3.3d, radio equipment does not harm the network or its functioning, nor misuse network resources, thereby causing an unacceptable degradation of service. That one is recently activated, and we will see that later on in a later slide. Article 3.3e, radio equipment incorporates safeguards to ensure that personal data and privacy of the user and of the subscriber are protected. Article 3.3f, radio equipment supports certain features ensuring protection from fraud. So articles 3.3d, e, and f are commonly known as the cybersecurity articles. We will go a little bit further in that in a later slide. Article 3.3g, that has been activated for several types of radio equipment, and it states that radio equipment must support certain features ensuring access to emergency services. Articles 3.3h, certain features in order to facilitate this use by users with a disability. That one has not been activated yet. Radio equipment supports certain features in order to ensure that software can only be loaded into the radio equipment, etc., etc. That one has also not been activated yet, although there are plans to activate it, especially since software-defined radios are becoming more common on the EU market. There are certain legacy publications which were initially and previously published for the RTD Directive for the essential requirements in Article 3.3g, access to emergency services. These legacy publications or decisions continue to apply for the essential requirements in Article 3.3g of the RED. So over the years, there have been several of these decisions published which define additional requirements where it concerns access to emergency services. So radio telephone service on inland waterways, avalanche beacons, AIS systems, well, these are all additional requirements to the requirements to comply with Article 3.2. There's also one on COSPAS SARSAT locator beacons, and there is one for marine radio communication equipment, which is intended to be used on non-SOLAS vessels and to participate in the GNDSS system. So these were already existing prior to the publication of the Radio Equipment Directive, and they continue to apply under the RED. There are also delegated regulations, as they are called now, not decisions, which has been specifically published for the RED to activate certain aspects of essential requirements for certain classes of radio equipment. So the first one, which is relevant in this case, is the Commission Delegated Regulation of 12 December 2018 with the date of application of March 17, 2022. This particular delegated regulation activates Article 3.3g for handheld mobile telephones with features similar to those of a computer in terms of capability to read and store data. The short description of that, it applies to smartphones. And this regulation introduces mandatory support for certain functions, such as automatically transmitting caller location in emergency communications for mobile devices, relating to calling the phone number 112, which is the EU phone number for emergency calling. If you call that number, your phone needs to let the receiver know where you are. Guidance of how to interpret the Commission delegated regulation of 12 December 2018 may be found on this particular link. I cannot guarantee that this link works always, because sometimes this particular part of the Europa website is slow or may not work fully. Back one slide. This regulation is already active because the date of application was March 17, 2022. So from that date onwards, all mobile phones within the scope of this regulation need to comply with it. There is no harmonized standard for this particular regulation. Article 3.3G for mobile phones or 112 calling requires that the manufacturer needs to go to a notified body for an EU type examination certificate. Now, there's also a Commission delegated regulation 2022-30 of October 29, 2021, and it's amended on 20 July 2023. And this delegated regulation activates the essential requirements in Article 3.3D, E, and F, cybersecurity, for certain classes of radio equipment. The date of application has been set to 1 August 2025. Initially, it was 1 August 2024, but there was an amendment to the regulation to set it 1 year ahead, simply because there were no standards available to use and check conformity with Articles 3.3D, E, and F. So the scope of this particular delegated regulation is quite wide. Radio equipment within the scope of Article 3.3D, it shall apply to any radio equipment that can communicate itself over the internet, whether it communicates directly or via any other equipment, internet connected radio equipment. So as you can imagine, that more or less encompasses a very wide range of products, which all need to comply with Article 3.3D as of 1 August next year. Article 3.3.E, it shall apply to any of the following radio equipment if that radio equipment is capable of processing personal data or traffic data or location data. And there's a bunch of references to the regulations which define what that exactly means. So there's several classes of equipment defined here. Internet connected radio equipment other than the equipment referred to in points B, C, or D. Point B, radio equipment or intended exclusively for childcare. Radio equipment covered by Directive 2009/48/EC, and radio equipment designed or intended, whether exclusively or not, to be worn, strapped to or hung from any of the following. And essentially, this is body-worn equipment. Again, the scope is pretty wide for Article 3.3E. Article 3.3F, that applies to any internet-connected radio equipment if that equipment enables the holder or user to transfer money, monetary value, or virtual currency. And again, there's a reference to another directive for the definitions of what this exactly means. As you understand, there's also a large range of products, for instance, cellular phones, smartphones, which fall within the scope of Article 3.3F. Some radio equipment is exempted by this regulation relating to cybersecurity. Fully exempted are medical devices under Regulation 2017-745 and 2017-746. And there's also radio equipment which is exempted for complying with Articles 3.3e and f, but not from the essential requirements in Article 3.3d. And that's radio equipment related to civil aviation, motor vehicles, and road toll systems. Involvement of a notified body for the red, and that has to be a notified body notified as being to the European Commission as being capable to carry out the conformity assessment for those essential requirements in Article 3.3d, e and f. It's required in case there's no harmonized standards applied by the manufacturer to demonstrate conformity with those articles. The good news is that Senelec is developing harmonized standards in the context of the so-called cybersecurity articles of the RED. Harmonized standards for smart meters need involvement from member states because currently they have national requirements for all this, and they may differ by each member state. The standards currently being developed by Senelec are the EN 18031-1, -2 and -3. And as you can imagine that these respectively reference Article 3.3d, 3.3e, and 3.3f. And there's a picture here which basically confirms this and also confirms which aspects of those essential requirements are covered by which standard. We were told a couple of weeks ago during the WCA meeting in Dublin that the final drafts of these standards have been submitted for final vote within Senelec, and closure of the final vote is expected on the 27th of June 2024. The ratification of the final version is expected to take place on August 2, 2024, and the final text is expected to become available on August 30th, 2024. So the standard will become available 11 months before the regulation becomes active on August 1st, 2025. After the final text has become available, it will be presented to the European Commission for publication as harmonized standards, but no timeline is known at this point in time regarding the date of publication of the official journal of the EU. If the European Commission still may have some issues with those standards, it could be a lengthy process. The expectancy is that it may go smoothly, but still it's not expected that harmonized standards will be available, let's say 8 to 9 months before the actual date of application, which is August 1st, 2025. So that basically will give manufacturers relatively little time to make sure that their radio equipment complies with these requirements, which will then come into effect on that date. Members of the Radio Equipment Compliance Association, which have been provided with the final drafts of these 3 standards. It's possible that also members will come up with some questions about these standards. So we need to basically wait until there are harmonized standards. In the meantime, there are alternatives, but since the cybersecurity regulations only become effective on August 1st, 2025, there is no need to be compliant or declare compliance prior to that date. Article 3.4 of the RED, which is now a new essential requirement. It was basically already announced quite some time ago on 23rd of November 2022, and it was amended in June 2023 to correct a reference in standards or a date in standards. So basically, it will introduce requirements to implement a certain charging connector on radio equipment, on specified radio equipment to be exact. So in Annex 1A, Part 1, there is a list of radio equipment which needs to comply with Article 3.4 when the date of applicability is there. So it's handheld mobile phones, tablets, digital cameras, headphones, etc., etc. There is a list of, I think, 11 types of radio equipment for which this new requirement will be valid. The date of application of Article 3.4 of the RED is December 28, 2024 for all radio equipment classes except for one. The radio equipment class laptops, there the date of applicability of application is 28th of April 2026. So on both dates, if you ship products into the EU on that date and onwards, you need to comply with this particular Article 3.4. And it sets the requirements for the mandatory use of a USB-C receptacle for charging purposes. So radio equipment capable of being recharged by means of wired charging, the categories of classes of radio equipment, they need to be equipped with the USB Type-C receptacle as described in the standard EN IEC 62680-1-3 2022, and that receptacles shall remain accessible in operation at all times. The second point is that radio equipment shall also be capable of being charged with cables which comply with the standard EN IEC 62680-1-3 2022. This does not mean that cables are suddenly within the scope of the RED. It only states that you need to have a charging port which is capable to interface with such cables. The current decisions of regulation states wired charging. The Commission is busy planning an update which could also include wireless charging. So radio equipment capable of being recharged by means of wired charging at voltages higher than 5 volts, currents higher than 3 amps, or powers higher than 15 watts, then you also need to support USB power delivery as described at EN IEC 62680-1-2 2022. And you also must ensure that any additional charging protocol allows for the full functionality of the USB power delivery. So this means that it's not forbidden to have two charger ports or two charging protocols supported by the radio equipment. It does mean, however, that in all circumstances you must include USB-C connector, you must support power delivery for the conditions noted on this slide. And if you use any other charging protocol that cannot interfere or disable the USB power delivery required by Article 3.4. So there's also in the annex a number of additional parts, 2, 3, and 4. These are all related to labeling and instructions regarding information to the user. On specifications relating to the charging device you can use with a particular radio equipment. There's a pictogram which can be used for that particular purpose, and there's also a pictogram indicating whether or not the charging device is included with the radio equipment, because this Article 3.4 also notes that it is not mandatory to actually supply a charger with the radio equipment. Note that these ENIC standards are not harmonized standards, nor will they published as harmonized standards, but it's not necessary to obtain a EU type examination certificate from a notified body, since the conformity assessment procedures in the RD also have been tweaked, and Article 3.4 allows at any time self-declaration of compliance. There's guidance relating to the implementation of the requirements in Article 3.4, and that can be found on that particular link. One slide on a topic which are regularly yield questions, which is display and demonstration of radio equipment. That's noted in Article 9 of the RED. You can display radio equipment, but if it doesn't comply with the RED, you need to put a sign up there that you cannot switch it on or put it into service, and that you can also not place it on the market. So you can only demonstrate radio equipment in such cases if you have permission from the EU member state in question. Obligation of manufacturers. The majority of non-compliances which market surveillance finds have everything to do with the obligation of manufacturers, and in particular the administrative part of compliance with the RED. So we quickly go through all the obligations of the manufacturers. Obviously, item 1 is kind of an open door. You must ensure that it's designed and manufactured in accordance with the essential requirements of Article 3 of the RED. Number 2 is quite important. You must ensure that you can actually put the radio equipment in service or operate in at least one member state. If you try to place radio equipment on the market which cannot be used in any member state, that's not allowed. It also implies that a notified body cannot issue a EU type examination certificate for radio equipment which cannot be used in any EU member state. There needs to be at least one. Manufacturers need to draw the technical documentation. And if you have done that, you shall also draw up the DOC and affix the CE marking. You need to keep the technical documentation and the DOC for 10 years after the radio equipment has been placed on the market. Manufacturers shall ensure that procedures are in place for series production to remain in conformity with the RED. This is often an overlooked issue. It implies that you need to have some sort of quality system in place to ensure continued compliance. This is not something a notified body needs to check, but as a manufacturer, this is one of the conditions under which you can draw up your EU DOC and also affix the CE marking on the product. It also notes that you need to carry out, as a manufacturer, you need to carry out sample testing to make sure that everything is still compliant, and if you find any issues, you need to take appropriate measures. Manufacturers shall ensure that radio equipment bears a type, batch, or serial number or other element allowing its identification. And if the size doesn't allow it, you need to provide it on a packaging or in a document accompanying the radio equipment. Manufacturers also shall indicate on the radio equipment the name, registered trade name, and registered trademark, and a postal address at which they can be contacted. Again, when the size doesn't allow it, there are options to put it in another place. And the address shall indicate a single point at which the manufacturer can be contacted. And you should also put it in a language easily understood by end users and market surveillance authorities, which is a particular important point in the EU because, well, each member state has its own language. And you cannot expect that everybody in a given EU member state can speak or understand English, for instance. Manufacturers shall ensure that the radio equipment is accompanied by instructions and safety information in language which can be easily understood by consumers and other end users. This is usually limited to instructions and safety information which, when not followed, can cause a hazardous situation. The following information also needs to be in the information to the user, which is the frequency bands in which the radio equipment operates and the maximum radio frequency power transmitted in the frequency bands. It does not specify that it must be presented in the user manual itself. A compliance flyer or a separate document is typically also acceptable. You shall ensure as a manufacturer that each radio equipment is accompanied by a copy of the EU DOC or by a simplified EU DOC. And where the simplified EU DOC is used, then you should also note an internet address where the full text of the EU DOC can be obtained or observed. In case of restrictions of putting into service of radio equipment, the information must be available on the packaging, which either indicates member states with a restriction in use or a certain geographical area within a member state where restriction of putting into service may exist. It also applies, for instance, to licensed equipment. If you need an individual user license, that's a restriction in use. The packaging shall indicate the member state or geographical area within the member state, and the information must be completed in the instructions accompanying the radio equipment. If manufacturers have reason to believe that radio equipment is no longer in conformity, then obviously there shall be corrective actions needed to bring that radio equipment into conformity, to withdraw it or recall it. And if there's a risk involved, hazardous risk, then manufacturers also need to inform the authorities of the member state in which they made the radio equipment available. Manufacturers also need to respond to a reasoned request from a competent national authority to provide it with all the information and documentation in paper or electronic form necessary to demonstrate conformity of radio equipment with the RED in a language which can be easily understood by that authority. Again, most of the non-compliances found by market surveillance authorities are administrative, incomplete technical documentation, incomplete declaration of conformities, etc., etc. Then we have Article 16, presumption of conformity if you apply harmonized standards, which have been published in the official journal of the European Union, then EU member states must presume that the radio equipment is in conformity with the essential requirements, unless the member state can prove that it is not. If you use a non-harmonized standard, the burden of evidence is exactly the other way around. If the member states think radio equipment is not in compliance, then the manufacturer has the burden of proof to demonstrate that it's in compliance with the directive. The conformity assessment procedures. As a manufacturer, you need to perform a conformity assessment. You have several options for this. You can demonstrate compliance of radio equipment with the essential requirements set out in Article 3.1, and that includes EMC and safety, and Article 3.4 of the RED using any of the following conformity assessment procedures. So internal production control, that's basically self-declaration. You can also choose to go to a notified body, and if you have full quality assurance arranged with a notified body, you can obviously use Annex 4 for this. But here you have the choice to go to a notified body or not go to a notified body, including Article 3.4. If you have applied harmonized standards in full, and harmonized standards are harmonized when references have been published in the official journal of the EU, then also for Article 3.2 and 3.3, you can have three options: self-declaration, go to a notified body, or use full quality assurance in accordance with Annex 4 of the RED. However, if you only apply parts of harmonized standards or non-harmonized standards to demonstrate compliance with Articles 3.2 and 3.3, then you need to go to either a notified body or you need to set up a full quality assurance arrangement with a notified body. So here you have only two options, and self-declaration is not one of those. The EU Declaration of Conformity, it shall state that fulfillment of the essential requirements set out in Article 3 of the RED has been demonstrated, and there is a model structure in Annex 6 of the Radio Equipment Directive. So your DOC needs to contain all those elements in that annex, and it shall be continuously updated. So that means if you use a harmonized standard and it's updated, you need to verify if a paper assessment would be sufficient, or if retesting or additional testing is required, after which you need to update your DOC. Because if those standards, revised standards, become active or the sole version to be applied, on that particular date, you need to demonstrate compliance with those new requirements, and also your DOC must be updated as of that date. There's a simplified EU Declaration of Conformity, which is basically a sentence which confirms or which states that all the essential requirements in Article 3 has been met, and you need to translate that in all the languages required by the EU member state. Full text can be then made available somewhere on the internet, and the internet address can be placed above or below the simplified EU DOC. So where radio equipment is subject to more than one Union Act requiring EU Declaration of Conformity, you shall draw up a single EU Declaration of Conformity in respect of all such Union Acts. And by drawing up your EU DOC, the manufacturer shall assume responsibility for the compliance of the radio equipment with the requirements laid down in the RED. So if, for instance, you have an EU type examination certificate, in the end, the EU signing the EU DOC is the responsibility of the manufacturer, and as such, the primary responsibility of compliance is always at the manufacturer. CE marking. CE marking used to have a minimum size of 5 millimeters. That has been changed in the RED, now can be 5 millimeters or less, provided that it remains visible and legible. Technical documentation, Annex 5 of the Radio Equipment Directive notes the elements which at the minimum should be in your technical documentation. And it also shall be drawn up before radio equipment is placed on the market and shall be continuously updated, either because there are updates in the product or updates in the standards or other documents which have been used to demonstrate compliance with the essential requirements. The technical documentation and correspondence relating to any EU type examination procedure shall be drawn up in official language of the member state in which the notified body is established, or in a language acceptable to that notified body. So if you need to go to a notified body, it does not always mean that you can present your technical documentation in a language of your choosing. Non-compliances, actual formal non-compliances, this was never noted in the RMTTE directive, but in the radio equipment directive, there is actually an article which lists formal non-compliances where a member state can basically act on. So the CE marking has been effective violation of Article 30 of Regulation 765/2008. Basically, if you put the CE marking on there, but one or more requirements have not been met, the CE marking has not been affixed. That's also a formal non-compliance. In the RTTE directive, you were obliged to note next to the CE marking the identification of the notified body, but only with the RED, that's only required if a manufacturer uses Annex 4, which is for quality assurance. In all other cases, you cannot use the identification of the notified body number on your label anymore. The EU DOC has not been drawn up. The EU DOC has not been drawn up correctly. Those 2 points are particularly popular with the market surveillance authorities. Technical documentation is either not available or not complete. Information in Article 10, 6, 7, and 12.3 is absent, false, or incomplete. The information of the intended use of the radio equipment does not accompany the radio equipment. It's a formal non-compliance. Requirements on identification of the economic operators set out in Article 15 are not fulfilled, and Article 5 is not complied with. And if the non-compliance persists, then the member state needs to take all appropriate measures to restrict or prohibit the radio equipment continue to be made available in the market. And sometimes they can even require that's withdrawn or recalled from the market. So this was a quick overview of the most important issues in the radio equipment directive, including some of the latest updates. And this was my last slide. So I don't know if there are any questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Peter, for such a very informative webinar. I'm going to go ahead and check to get to the questions. I know we had quite a few. So give me one moment as I go to the top. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm also looking at them.
First question, it says, great presentation. If I heard correctly, Peter stated manufacturers need to check with each member state to determine if a radio product can be operated, in each member state. Is my understanding correct? If so, how does a manufacturer complete this activity for each member state? Is there a list of the regulatory agencies that need to be contacted for each member state?
Okay, so there are two possibilities. One possibility is that the CAPT has on their website a part which is called EFIS. That's a frequency information system for the EU or for Europe, actually. That's a place where you can or could check if certain frequencies are allowed in certain member states and for which purposes these frequencies are used. So that's one. The EFIS system is a little bit complicated and not always up to date. Having said this, for the majority of regular radio equipment, the European Commission also has issued decisions, and those decisions nowadays come with an implementation overview. It can be found on the EU website. What I can do is, when this presentation will be provided to all the attendees, that I will add a slide with a couple of useful links where you can observe all that information. So it's in most cases it's not necessary to contact each member state individually. There are databases, there are lists, but in special cases, yes, you need to do that. There is a particular list somewhere, but I will need to find it, and I also will put it on an additional slide.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question. Why are many of the ETSI EN standards, which primarily cover radio equipment, only listed under the EMC directive, i.e. listed on the EMCD OJ and excluded from the red?
Okay, so the fact that it's an ETSI standard, which covers radio equipment, I'm not sure if there are many left anymore because they will remove a whole lot of these. It's basically a remainder of what happened under the old RNTTE directive. For the old RNTTE directive, you could demonstrate compliance with Article 31A, 31B, using standards harmonized under the EMC directive, but that's gone. So that's one reason. The other reason is that those ETSI standards are pretty outdated, and if they are not specifically written for the RED, you cannot use them by default. And I believe that most of these are quite outdated and also will be removed at some point in time. There is one for charging devices which will be removed, and I think there's others which also will be removed. The requirements of the European Commission for ETSI standards under the RWD are pretty high at this moment, and none of those ETSI standards which may now be still listed under the EMC directive do not meet those criteria.
All right, thank you. Next question. Regards Article 3.3H, I gather that this refers to hearing aid compatibility. Do you envision that HAC will be similar to FCC HAC or HAC requirements?
Okay, so yes, it could refer to hearing aid compatibility. It could also reference the size of characters on the screen. But I haven't heard that there's any plans in the EU to include HAC requirements like the FCC has in place. If they would start up a plan like that, it will take years before that will actually be a mandatory requirement. Currently, to my knowledge, there are no HAC requirements similar to what the FCC is requiring. Currently, it's left to the responsibility of the manufacturers.
All right, thank you. Next question. Which EN 18031 standard applies to cellular and Wi-Fi products? And they said thank you.
Okay, so yeah, it depends on the capabilities of the product. So you know, cellular products, if you can make payments with it, like wireless payments using RFID, yeah, these are most certainly subject to the -3. They can connect directly indirectly to the internet, so -1 is always applicable, and -2 is almost certainly applicable because that's what cellular phones nowadays do. You need to have a extremely basic cellular phone would you escape those requirements. For Wi-Fi products, it's more complicated. At least the -1 will apply. If the other two will apply, that depends on what the Wi-Fi product supports. I mean, if it doesn't support monetary exchanges on its own, yes, it would not need to comply with that. If it doesn't share location information, yes, sure, it doesn't need to comply with that. But if it shares its location, which could possibly be tied back to a person, yes, then the -2 would be applicable. So you need to look at it product by product, and for each product you will need to establish which standard or which essential requirement would be applicable.
All right.
Okay. Shall I just write the because I also have the questions in front of me? Yeah.
Okay.
So do you think that the Cyber Resilience Act will adopt the existing various EN in whole or in part? Yes, that's the idea. if it will, the question is if it will fully cover everything within the CRA. Nobody's sure at this moment, but the idea is that it will cover the CRA requirements um, for the most part, for 90% or something like that. It's not the intention to write something completely new. There are standards in progress, but it is my understanding that both work groups of Senelec are communicating with each other to make sure that they will not duplicate each other's work or create suddenly completely different standards.
Okay, next question. Can a QR code be used to satisfy the regulatory information to the user?
In the EU, I would say no. The, I have seen one opinion of somebody a couple of years ago which referenced to some kind of interpretation, but I never could find that interpretation. The answer would be no at this moment. It also applies to often the question is asked if you can use electronic labeling for the CE mark. The answer always used to be no, but now it is yes, but you also need to put the CE mark on the device itself. So it doesn't gain you anything. Electronic display of CE mark and associated information or the use of QR codes. For some reason, EU member states are still a little bit scared of that. Okay, does manufacturer module C needs to be identical with type examination holder module B? Okay, so actually, there is in the RED guide of 2018 an interpretation which states that a manufacturer, let's say in this case for the module C, if it has the identical product for which an EU type examination certificate exists, but with a different manufacturer name, that you can basically adopt that EU type examination certificate. But that only applies in those cases where you basically will source the exact same product. However, if you put your own name on it as manufacturer under module C, then technically you need to do your own conformity assessment. And if a notified body would be involved, well, then that type examination certificate needs to be reissued in your name. Having said this, if a type examination certificate exists, a notified body should accept that existing type examination certificate in case the appropriate technical documentation is submitted, and also a declaration that that device is exactly the same except for the brand name and possible color or whatever. So the answer is yes, but there are some caveats in there. There is a interpretation in the RBD guide for that situation. Okay, regarding cybersecurity article 3.3G, by all equipment, that means that equipment connected with another equipment that has radio via wired ISO CAN will require testing. Yeah, the answer is yes. That is correct. Article 10.2, we notify bodies responsible for compliance with essential requirements in Article 3. Manufacturers responsible for compliance with Article 10.2. Why notify body cannot issue a type examination certificate if the requirement of 10.2 is not fulfilled? Notified body should not check 10.2 because it's out of its scope. No, it's actually not, because a notified body is not allowed to issue an EU type examination for radio equipment which cannot be used in the EU. It's as simple as that. Because if you would issue an EU type examination certificates that it complies with the essential requirements, then if you cannot use it, there are also no essential requirements.
Okay.
Yeah,
You,
yeah. The fact is, if it cannot be used, there can also not be a certificate, because the certificate would actually demonstrate that it can be used in at least one EU member state. Okay. As the essential requirements set out in Article 3.d shall apply to any radio equipment that can communicate itself over the internet. Okay, that's from my slide. What specific equipment will be affected for this new amendment? For instance, for automotive devices like display or cluster with immobilizer and are communicating directly or indirectly to another ECU. The answer to the question is yes. That would be also within the scope of the cybersecurity requirements, and it says we are not responsible for the other ECUs that are connected to the internet, just for the cluster. The OEMs are asking for an official statement from the certification body that clusters are impacted for this article. Well, so the thing with automotive is that automotive manufacturers, at least the ones who build the cars, are somewhat special, because normally the idea is, and the RED also states that a manufacturer of radio equipment must guarantee that it operates with ancillary equipment or accessories, and that it will still comply with the directive. So if you would follow the directive, the RED, literally, that means that if you have an immobilizer which communicates with an ECU and uses that ECU to connect to the internet, that you as a manufacturer should check if your immobilizer remains compliant with the directive when tested with that other ECU. But I know that there are discussions, particularly for automotive manufacturers, how to approach this issue, because currently, even though an automotive manufacturer of cars, for instance, is technically responsible for the car as a whole, it does not need to be CE marked as a whole. So I know that if you follow the directive, yes, you need to take the ECU or any ECU which could be connected to the immobilizer into account. But I know that there is currently discussion on that. Okay. Okay, are there any exemptions for cybersecurity if exclusively used in business or commercial environments? The answer is no. It's a similar question if certain requirements are, if for instance, how do you call it? Let me see. Yeah, well, the answer is no, because the text in all those directives or regulations never make a distinction between business or commercial. And I often get the question if, for instance, industrial products are exempted for certain requirements, and the answer is also no, because the word industrial basically never occurs in any of the regulations. How is a radio module integration managed with respect to the RED? Well, that depends. If you integrate a radio module in a host device, which results in an end product, the end product is then the radio equipment. So that means that the builder of the end product needs to assess the end product to ensure that the whole thing complies with the requirements of the RED. Sometimes the radio module has its own EU type examination certificate or its own DOC, but there are certain aspects which change when you build a radio module inside a host device. Things like radiated emissions, things like possibly receiver sensitivity or receiver immunity. So you cannot accept a DOC or type examination certificate for a radio module for the full 100%. If you integrate it with host equipment, you need to reassess the end product, and often you would need to retest radiated emissions, spurious emissions. You would need to retest EMC because EMC behavior of a radio module may completely change when it's in the actual product. And you need to reassess safety to the extent that if the module itself has been assessed for safety in a particular environment, and that environment matches with the environment inside the product, then you basically can easily adopt existing results. But in all cases, you need to reassess the end product. DOC and CE marking state only that product complies with essential requirements. DOC and CE does not confirm compliance with any formal requirements. Is that understanding correct? I am not sure what formal requirements are, but if it's meant that formal requirements are standards, standards are just an aid to demonstrate compliance with the essential requirements. And the model DOC in the RED actually does require that you note on your DOC how it was determined that you comply with the essential requirements, which documents were used or which standards were used or which procedures were used. Again, I'm not sure what any formal requirements mean. Okay, any requirements for the wired telecommunication equipment in the EU? Are these standards mandatory for telecom terminal equipment? Okay, so TTE equipment is no longer in the radio equipment directive. That was removed from the RTTE directive. Currently, wired telecommunication equipment falls within the scope of the low voltage directive and the EMC directive. And the noted standards like ES203-021 are these standards mandatory for telecom terminal equipment? No, standards are never mandatory. However, the EU has definitions of TTE interfaces throughout the EU. So each country has their own TTE interface definitions, and there is a directive which requires that if you put something on the market, that it's supposed to interface correctly with those TTE endpoints. So the standards are not mandatory, but unfortunately there's very little alternative available to demonstrate compliance in such cases. But there is it's a responsibility of the manufacturer that he ensures that the device itself can operate with all the TTE interfaces for which the device is intended to be used. Let me see. In South Africa, moving in the direction of DOC, is it possible to access the documentation? I'm not sure what the question here is. So, yeah, maybe you can rephrase the question because I'm not sure what the question is here. If it's, I mean, if this means it's possible to access the documentation needed to get a DOC in South Africa, that depends on the manufacturer. You need to ask the manufacturer if that documentation could be made available for that particular purpose. Is equipment used for spectrum monitoring or interference searching considered radios under the RED? In principle, it's not excluded because these are receivers usually, and receivers fall within the scope of the RED. Okay, the EMC directive OJ, so the harmonized standards probably was last updated 2022-9-19. When we can expect an update? I know that the European Commission noted that several standards will be removed, and also ETSI noted that. So my guess is that there will be an update somewhere this year, but nowadays it's very hard to predict the intervals with which harmonized standard list will be updated. It's currently unknown, but there is something planned for that. As a manufacturer, are we obligated to provide CE DOC regardless who is asking from EU countries? Yes, well, you're obligated to provide one with each product you place on the market. So if somebody needs to ask for it, you didn't include it, and that's not correct. That's a form of non-compliance, technically. So end users and basically anyone can ask a manufacturer for a copy of the CE DOC. That situation shouldn't happen because the DOC is supposed to be already within with the radio equipment if you buy it. Okay. So I think there are no more questions.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for reading the questions and answering. You did such a great job. The last one was just saying thank you for the information and have a wonderful day. But us two at Washington Laboratories Academy and everyone, we want to thank you, Peter, for such a very informative webinar. If you do have additional questions after this webinar, he has placed so kindly his email on the screen. So make sure you jot that down. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any additional questions regarding this presentation at his convenience. Again, our thanks go to you, Peter, for taking time out to enlighten us about EU Radio Equipment Directive Update. Our next upcoming webinar will be on millimeter wave communication technologies. It is scheduled sometime in the month of July. We will also have additional monthly webinars such as Uniband and approvals, Mil Standard 810 DO160, and much more. So please make sure you visit our website to subscribe to our Washington Labs Academy to receive updates. This is easily done by visiting www.wll.com. You want to click on the training tab in the upper right corner and fill in your information where you see sign up for updates. On behalf of the Washington Labs Academy, we would like to thank you all for attending. I will now end the event and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.